Welcome to American Pulse. It's always a pleasure to have this guest in American Pulse show, Dr. Herb London. Welcome to the show, Dr. London. Dr. London has been in American Pulse more than 3 times. Dr. London is the president of London Center for Policy Research. Dr. London was the president of Hudson Center, Humanitarian Center. Dr. London has been doing a lot of activities to help the Egyptians in Egypt try to build the bridges between the Egyptian government and the American government. Dr. London has been exerting a lot of effort and time in trying to bring America back to what it was. Welcome to the show.
Well, pleasure to be with you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. London, and it's always a pleasure to have you on the show, and it's always nice to listen to what you have to say.
Well, it's always a treat to be with you as well.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. London, a lot of things are going on nowadays. I hate to start with the sad start, but I want to talk about Paris and what happened. I mean, there's so many times we had warned the world from terrorism, and you yourself came under a symposium that was organized by American Pulse, and you had brought the world attention that terrorism has to be defeated. But just give me your insight of the massacre.
Well, the massacre in Paris should be a wake-up call to the Europeans and to the American government as well. Terrorism is on our shores. We cannot avoid it. One of the real issues is that there are people who think this is far away, this is not going to affect us. I don't normally quote Trotsky, but Trotsky once said, "You may not want war, but war may want you." And we now find ourselves in a situation where ISIS has metastasized across the globe. This contagion of extremism is now very much a part of what is happening in European governments and in the Middle East. It has to be defeated, there is no doubt, because it represents a kind of medieval understanding of what Islam is and has not evolved into the 21st century. So they are engaged in a war that's an ideological war, a war against all of the things that the West stands for: individual rights, the rule of law, the free market, an understanding of one's role in society. All of that would be changed if an ISIS were to have the kind of domination over Western societies that they desire. So now it's a question of recognizing the fact that this is a war, it's a long war, and how do we fight it effectively? And one of the ways to fight it effectively is for the United States to try to unite with the Sunni nations in the Middle East in creating what we at the London Center for Policy Research have called the NATO of the Middle East, led by Egypt, including Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Kuwait, that would serve as a counterweight to the ambitions of Iran and the ambitions of ISIS. And we see that force playing a very significant role. Now, the United States has the diplomacy to bring that force together, has the special forces, has the logistics, has the military equipment to help that force be put in place and serve a very significant role in creating equilibrium and order in the Middle East.
But the question that strikes me all the time, that the United States are not doing that, and I don't know why. I hate to say that some people from the Middle East are pointing fingers at us and saying that we created ISIS, we made them prosper, we gave them the weapons, we let them grow. What do you think?
Well, first of all, ISIS was created by the United States in an odd way. During the Iraq War, there were the Shia militias. They were dominating the country. And Petraeus was one of those people who argued, as the general in the area, he argued that what we needed was a Sunni militia to serve as a counterweight or some sort of counterforce for the Shia militia that were dominating the country. And so he helped to create
So it created the monster.
He didn't know it was a monster. It has morphed into ISIS. The equipment that they have is American equipment. The Humvees that they're driving are American Humvees. The tanks in their possession are American tanks, because we provided that sort of equipment. When the United States left precipitously, which was a terrible mistake, this was in the Obama era, because there was the possibility of joint forces agreement between Iraq and the United States. We imposed certain requirements on the joint forces agreement that the Iraqis could not possibly live with.
And I think there's a video of President Bush was warning from this happening way before it happened.
Had we left 10,000 troops there, there is no doubt that there would not have been an ISIS. But keep in mind that ISIS did not face any opposition. So the Sunni militias that morphed into ISIS have become a force that seems to be almost inevitable. You cannot stop it. Why can't you stop it? Because the Iraqi army is a paper army. When they confront any enemy, they drop their weapons and run away. So there isn't any opposition that they faced. And even the United States at this moment is fighting a very reluctant war in the Middle East. We send in 7 sorties a day. When we were fighting in Fallujah, we sent in 750 sorties a day. So is that a serious effort? The air commander told me, by the way, very recently, this was the general air commander of the Middle East, American forces. He said to me, we send in 7 sorties, but 3 come back with their ordnance intact.
Wow.
So don't even bomb. So what we're talking about is not a serious effort. Now, maybe after the terrible atrocities in Paris, we'll start getting serious. But up to now, that is not the case. And the president said yesterday he is not going to change his strategy. Now, that's a mistake. I think the strategy has to evolve. And if ISIS has the kind of capabilities that it's demonstrated, then our strategy has to change accordingly. That has not occurred.
Herb London, let me ask you, we heard Frank talk about having real concerns about the president's mindset. In 30 seconds, your take on the president and his response or lack of response to what's going on.
The president is engaged in both a psychological and a real retreat from world affairs. This is a form of withdrawal on every stage. What the president is suggesting is that the intervention of the United States does not have positive outcomes. And so he's not willing to deploy forces in an appropriate manner anywhere. When we fight a war, it's a partial war. He does not understand that the war with ISIS is indeed a total war.
Ironically, the president on the same day in the morning had said that ISIS was contained in the region, and it was just, I feel like it was a slap on the face that they attacked on that same day. Do you think there was a message behind attacking Paris in particular rather than any other place in the world, or just...
Well, I think there is a message. One, Paris is a city of lights and a kind of standard for Western civilization. 2, it is the city of light, a city of light that they could make very dark. And 3, there's a very large Muslim population within France. So it is sending a message to the French people. Within this population, there are those who are sympathetic to our point of view.
They're trying to wake him up to do more attacks?
That's correct. So it was a wake-up call, not merely for the West, it was a wake-up call for ISIS supporters within Europe. And keep in mind, with the refugees moving in large numbers across the Mediterranean into Europe, many of them could conceivably be ISIS. And at least one of the people who were engaged in this attack was a refugee who came from North Africa into Europe.
What do you think of that threat to the U.S.? Do we feel that this, God forbid, could happen, especially like now we're in the holiday seasons and there's a lot of people here in the U.S. Do you think are we under threat of any attack?
I think, look, there's no known threat that the FBI or the CIA has reported. That doesn't mean there isn't a threat. We know that there are at least 250 ISIS supporters within the United States. We know that.
We know that for sure.
Yes, the president has said there are 1,250, this president's view, 1,250 who fall into the category of having some ties to ISIS forces in the Middle East. That doesn't mean they're ISIS supporters. They've had some ties to them. 250 fall into the category of being ISIS supporters. This is dangerous. Under any circumstances, this is dangerous because think about walking into Grand Central Station in the middle of rush hour. Even though there are well-armed people there to protect the citizens.
Impossible. It's impossible.
How can you protect everyone? There's so much traffic. There are so many people. And I'm only using that as an illustration.
How can you screen everybody?
You can't. How do you screen everyone? It's impossible to do that. So there is a vulnerability that exists in an open society. We don't stop people everywhere. And I'm not sure you can in an open society. So the vulnerabilities clearly do exist. Can the ISIS people take advantage of that? I hope not. One of the things that becomes perfectly clear, Michael, is that the Second Amendment takes on greater meaning today than ever before. People want to arm themselves. They want to feel as though they can protect themselves. Had one of those, 2 or 3 of those people sitting in that rock concert hall in Paris had a weapon, they might have killed those guys who were trying to kill them. So again, it raises a lot of questions about the way in which you protect yourself in an open society.
But now let me think outside the box a little bit, because I've been watching what has been happening from this administration that we currently have, and there are different things that were imposed, like, you know, the immigration laws and the borders, unarming people. So is that, are those pieces of the bigger picture that can expose us to attacks without being able to protect our own selves?
The borders in the United States are porous, both south and northern borders, and it's very worrisome because it's one thing for drug traffickers to come across the Rio Grande. It's quite another thing for ISIS supporters to come across the Rio Grande. These are very dangerous times. We have to do something to close that border, and the president has not been sufficiently active in doing so. A part of the wall has been created, but only a couple of hundred miles. It's a wall that needs about 1,400 miles in order to protect America. We are not doing that at the moment.
So do you think currently for New York City, and I know that you're big your big involvement in New York, do you think that the FBI, NYPD are taking safety measures for the coming up holiday season?
I think these guys who represent our counterterrorist group in New York do a fabulous job, and they have to be commended. But as good as they are, there is no such thing as a perfect system.
How can we help them out as individuals?
I think that there are many ways. One, I think people have to be conscious of the threat that now exists. And in the past, you would see things like a package that would be lying in a subway system. Okay, so it's a package. I think it is important for the citizenry to take the threat seriously and to report everything they see, so that an increased awareness of what is going on around you is very important. Don't walk the streets just looking ahead. Look around you. See what people are doing. Look at the people who you see on the streets. Something suspicious, it should be reported. Now, again, this means that the police are going to have to do a lot more than they're doing at the moment. It's more work. But at the same time, it's better to be careful, to engage in precautions, rather than to allow these events to occur. One event, 500 people lose their lives because someone walks in with an AK-47 and starts firing. It paralyzes the city and maybe paralyzes the country.
Yes. I mean, as you see, and this is my next point, you know, Egypt has been hit very bad after the crash of that airplane, the Russian airplane, over the Sinai Peninsula. So what do you think of that?
Well, it was probably organized by ISIS. And it might have been some handler who put a bomb on that plane. My feeling about it is that there were a number of coordinated events that occurred one right after the other. The bombing of the plane, in the Russian plane over Sinai.
It's like three birds, one stone, right?
Exactly. Lebanon and the bombings that occurred in Lebanon, and then, of course, the Paris atrocities. All of that coming on the heels of one another. Obviously, this is organized. This is an attempt to intimidate the West. The strategy that is being employed by ISIS is a strategy of intimidation. Make you feel uncomfortable. Make you feel as though your society is not stable. That's what they're trying to achieve. And it's not that difficult to do if you consider the fact that unarmed people are going to be walking the streets of Paris or the streets of London or the streets of New York, and they can easily be killed. And that is something that we in a free society have to adjust to. We have to adjust to it.
It's not fair. But I couldn't help but notice that, you know, Egypt has been fighting terrorism for almost 2 years now. France has been finally on board and giving weapons to Egypt and trying to help out in the war on terror. Russia has been very supportive of Egypt after America has not been, and the Russian government has been trying to fight ISIS in Syria for the longest time ever. So I feel like it's a message for other countries to scare them away from coming in the region and fighting ISIS. Am I crazy or?
Well, you raised a lot of interesting questions. The first, I think, and most important is that the Russians have their own agenda. And the agenda is to insinuate themselves into every aspect of Middle East policy, to be the strong horse in the region.
Especially when we withdrew ourselves from there.
You may remember Sadat forced them out in 1973.
Yeah.
But now the Russians are back, and we've invited them back. And we invited them back in Syria when we said we drew a red line against poison gas, and then when we wouldn't act, We asked the Russians to act for us.
We give them the open field. Yeah.
We've given them an opportunity to create the Eastern Mediterranean. For the first time in the last 30 years, we don't have a carrier force in the Persian Gulf. Now, one is moving there now, and the French are moving one there, but the Russians have one. They have it in their port in Syria. So, I mean, it raises a lot of geopolitical questions about what is happening, plus the fact with the Russians moving into the Middle East, now appearing as though they're a responsible party. Everyone has forgotten Crimea.
Yeah. I mean, we don't talk about it anymore.
Not discussed. Not discussed. The Eastern Ukraine, no longer discussed.
No.
So the Russians have a distinct advantage, and that is to try and create the Russian or the Soviet power of the past, which is, of course, the Putin strategy. And we have become complicit. Keep in mind that President Obama in 2011, when the civil war in Syria began, he said, Assad must go. Bashar Assad must go. At the recent Vienna conference, Secretary Kerry said, well, we have to choose between Assad and ISIS, Assad. We choose Assad. Let's say that Assad is there for the foreseeable future. So we've gone from Assad must go to Assad will stay for the foreseeable future.
And then probably Assad, we're supporting Assad in the next step.
And the Russians have forced us into that position. The Russians are dictating foreign policy to the United States at the moment. It's an odd set of conditions, but this is what Obama has allowed to occur largely because of our weakness. We had the opportunity to support the Free Syrian Army in 2011, 12, 13. We did not do so. Now the Russians have bombed our rebels, forcing us in the position of saying it's Assad or ISIS.
Yeah. The way I look at it, the bombing or the crashing of that Russian airplane, I mean, I think it has been confirmed there was a bomb, right?
Right.
So the way I think about it is that they know that Egypt has a good ties with the Russians. They know that tourism in Egypt forms about the third of the tourism in Egypt are Russian tourists, and at the same time it's a big industry that a lot of people live off of from tourism in Egypt. And they know that Sinai is an area where there's a lot of talks about, especially with the deal that we heard about with Morsi selling part of the land to Israel through America. So I think that they fear the strong ties between the Egyptians, the Russians, and now Bashar Assad.
Well, let me make a point about that, Michael, because I remember President Sisi saying, "I'm for America, but America's not for me." He begged the United States for the military equipment necessary to fight the war in the Sinai.
And
he recognizes the fact that they've taken heavy casualties. The Egyptians have taken heavy casualties in this war, and it's not been recognized. And the Americans have not replied effectively, or at least satisfactorily, for the kind of request that has been made by Sisi. So he's turned to the Russians. It's a reluctant turn. I don't think that Sisi wanted to deal with the Russians, but the $2 billion arms deal that he has with Russia today has been brought about in large part because the United States refused to provide the F-16s, the tanks, and the spare parts for the Apaches. So when he did not get that, he turned to the Russians. Yeah. So the Saudis are picking up that $2 billion bill, but it's not as if Sisi was wildly enthusiastic about dealing with the Russians.
He just
he had no alternative.
I mean, I feel, and excuse the expression that I would say, but this I learned here in the streets of New York City, is that you cannot be half pregnant. It's either you're with Egypt or with that, or against Egypt, right?
I think that's right.
I mean, the way we're dealing, our government here in the U.S. dealing with Egypt is very vague. They're supportive in one end and they're against it in another end. Sisi had no choice but to go to the Russians.
Well, the reason why I consider it a significant strategic mistake is because Egypt can play a very powerful role in the creation of this, what I've described as this NATO in the Middle East, a defense force where nations have some capabilities. If they would pool their defensive capabilities, they would be a very formidable fighting force. And with American logistics and American soldiers, or special forces, I should say, we don't have to deploy a lot of soldiers, but with special forces and American logistics and the kind of equipment that we could put into this battle, we could defeat ISIS fairly easily. It's not as if ISIS is a major force,
That's what I'm thinking. Why is this taking more than it should?
because there's no opposition. If we're sending in 7 sorties a day, and only 3 come back with their ordnance, it's not serious. Look,
It's a joke. It's a show.
one of the dimensions of this war against ISIS is that there cannot be any collateral damage. Now, you cannot fight a war without collateral damage.
Absolutely.
There was a scene, in fact, I saw it on TV last night, where there were pictures of ISIS forces marching through the northern Iraq area, and they were driving their Humvees in a major town and waving at the CBS, NBC cameras. We are successful, right? Suppose I were President of the United States. Let's wave a magic wand. I would say, we have
Well, you'd be very efficient.
well, we have an aircraft called the Warthog, the A-10. That is the most effective air-land support aircraft in the world. It has a very powerful cannon on it. Suppose as they were cheering their victory, there were 10, 20,000 ISIS members right there. I get 5 Warthogs, they're gone. It's over. Now, it's true the president will say there will be collateral damage, and I will admit that. And I don't want any innocent person to die. But you can't fight a war if you're unwilling to kill the enemy. You have to be able to do that. And in doing so, there will be people who lose their lives. It's a terrible thing to say. I mean, when we bombed Germany during World War II, it wasn't only Nazis we were bombing. There were a lot of innocent people who were killed. It's terrible. But at the same time, you're fighting a war. You either fight the war and defeat the enemy, or you do not. The president used the words, degrade and destroy. Well, how can you degrade and destroy if you're unwilling to fight?
Yeah.
I don't know how you do that.
Not only that, he's giving them the chance to grow bigger and be stronger.
Exactly. So, I think that there's an awful lot to be said about the strategy or lack thereof in this administration. But the point is, these are matters that could be remedied. With a different kind of leader, I think you can challenge the people in ISIS. You can challenge them. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but it seems to me this is an army made up largely of misfits. You get 16-year-olds in Europe, and they're saying, we want to join ISIS. Why? Because if you read the website, there are 2 things that your 16-year-olds want. Girls, and they can get concubines, and weapons. It's a venture. It's an adventure.
And for the psychos that would like, the psychics that they'd like to kill everybody.
But this is an army of 16-year-olds. You mean the United States Marines cannot defeat an army of 16-year-olds?
It's a joke.
It's a joke. But if you don't fight them, if you really don't fight them, and if you rely on the Peshmerga, who are using World War II vintage weapons, and if you send weapons to the Peshmerga through Iraq, and they end up in the Iranian black market, then you're not serious.
I'm glad you brought up the Iranians. What's the deal with Iran? What's going on with the nuclear deal? Why is this, again, I feel like, I had mentioned this to you before that, I feel like there's a World War III, and you told me it's 4, because 3 is already, was the Cold War. I feel like there's a World War coming up, and, what do you think?
In 1981, Bob Gates, who became the Secretary of Defense, and Brzezinski, who was, as you may remember, the National Security Advisor to Carter, wrote a paper. And in that paper, they said that Iran should be the stabilizing influence in the Middle East. Even 2 years after the Iranian Revolution, they said Iran could serve the role of forcing the Sunni nations into a somewhat different position. In 2004, the Iraqi study group, led by Lee Hamilton, a variety of others, used this paper. Bob Gates was in that group, saying we have to think seriously about using the Iranians as a counterforce in the region. That paper became the basis for the Obama strategy. Now, Bush didn't take it seriously, but Obama did. He has embraced it. That is the strategy for this government. We will withdraw, and since there is no such thing as a vacuum in nature or in politics, this vacuum will be filled by someone. Well, let it be filled by the Iranians, who will become the stabilizing influence. So in a way, we have promoted the idea of a geopolitical change in the Middle East. with Iran now standing as an empire. Keep in mind it has influence over Damascus, influence over Baghdad, influence over Sana'a. So it was already conceivably seen as one of the strong horses in the Middle East.
I want to talk more about Iran, Dr. London, right after this break. So welcome back to American Pulse with Dr. Herb London, and we were talking about Iran and their policy in the world now and how they wanted to be stabilizing the region. So,
well, again, stabilizing is the word that's used by the United States.
Exactly.
I don't think that it's really stabilizing. I'm using the terminology that would be used by our State Department. But what you see from the Iranians' point of view is that they have an extraordinary opportunity. They have the support of the United States. As a result of the nuclear deal, they have the support of the P5+1 and the Security Council. So now they have a virtual green light to do whatever they want to do in the Middle East. No word has been said about the terrorist activities that they promote. Yep. And here you have a nation that has been the hotbed of terrorist activities in promoting them around the globe, and not a word is being said of the condemnation of the Iranians. So they are given a green light to move ahead. And interestingly, what you now see with Yemen, the Qud forces in Yemen, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in Yemen, is that if you look at the portals to the Red Sea and you look at the Gulf of Hormuz, the Iranians control both. What does that mean for Saudi Arabia? Look at the map. It means that Saudi Arabia is surrounded. How do you transport your oil? And then on top of it, the oil fields in Saudi Arabia are located in the eastern part of the country. That part of Saudi Arabia, even though a Sunni nation, is Shia.
It's controlled by
So what the Persians have been saying is, we need the unification, ethnic unification of the Shia. Now, can you imagine a scenario in which Iran controls the oil in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, and in Iraq? That's 70% of the world's oil supply.
And yet,
it's presently $40 a barrel. Do you think it would be $40 a barrel under those circumstances?
Absolutely not. And yet our administration is supporting that.
Again, as I indicated to you before, it is based on an ideological view that the United States must engage in retreat and withdrawal, and that this vacuum would be filled by the Iranians, who can play the role of stabilizing the region.
Which is the same thing that what they thought that the Muslim Brotherhood would do in Egypt, right?
It is very much the same.
It's the same thing.
It is very much the same.
That's what they thought, right?
Exactly.
And
you may remember that this administration, after the Arab Spring, said, well, this is what the people want. The Muslim Brotherhood was elected democratically, so we have to support them, without any realization of what the internal politics of Egypt was all about. And this was a very, very naive point of view. When there were 33 million people on the streets of Egypt challenging Morsi, this government continued to assert that Sisi represented a military coup. Well, that's not a military coup when there are 33 million people on the streets. That's a popular uprising. That's a revolution. That is not a military coup. Now, we have all kinds of legislation against supporting a military coup. It was one of the reasons why initially no support could be provided to Sisi. But it was a complete misjudgment, a complete misunderstanding of what was happening in Egypt. And it wasn't only Obama missed the boat. There were other Americans, including McCain and Lindsey Graham, who didn't understand it as well. So my feeling is this is bipartisan misjudgment. In the case of Obama, he has continued to believe that this is the right stance. It's one of the reasons why Egypt has been put in the odd position of being the outlier in the making of American foreign policy, when in fact it could be right at the top of American foreign policy if we thought of Egypt more as an asset for American policy rather than as some sort of detriment.
What could be done to prevent the Iranian deal from happening and prevailing in the Middle East?
Well, it's already happened. I mean, there's nothing that you can say about the Iranian deal. They will comply, even if they do comply, it's 8 years, 10 years, or 12 years, they have a nuclear weapon. That's a given. Now, the odd thing about that, excuse me, is that when the president gave his Nobel Prize speech, he said the overarching responsibility for the presidency is to prevent nuclear proliferation.
Correct.
Now we see ourselves in the odd position where nuclear proliferation will occur because of this Iran deal. So that the president, in an odd way, has challenged his own position. He is now creating an environment where proliferation will occur. The NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, said you cannot enrich uranium up to a certain amount. That was part of the treaty. Iran signed, many nations signed. The treaty has zero value now because we are allowing Iran to enrich uranium beyond the levels that were first determined.
And we know that they're never going to comply. We know. They're already violating it. They're already
violating it. So, yes. So, I mean, but the point about this is, if you're Sisi or you're Salman in Saudi Arabia, first thing you're thinking of, we need a deterrent. If they're going to have nuclear weapons, we have to have something. So I know, and I'm sure you know, that someone is on the phone with the South Koreans and the French to deliver nuclear weapons to Egypt. And I know that someone in Saudi Arabia is on the phone with the Pakistanis to get nuclear weapons into Saudi Arabia. So we're going to see proliferation in the Middle East. That is a virtual inevitability. It will occur, and it will occur largely because of this deal. So the president has acted in a manner that's inconsistent with his own first and most serious obligation, and that is to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. It is happening, and it's happening on his watch, and it's happening because of the Iran deal.
But now if Iran has nuclear weapon, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, it's a disaster.
It could be a disaster in part because even if those nations do not use nuclear weapons, one, there is the fear of escalation strategy. That is, you fight a conventional war, you reach a certain point, could you use nuclear weapons? That's the danger. Second,
power,
because nuclear weapons are not merely a military weapon, they're a political weapon. And then the second, and I think very important thing is, if there are all of these nukes that are floating around the Middle East, maybe ISIS gets its hands on one. And it can be a non-state actor gets its hands on one. And let's say that non-state actor, recognizing that you can steal a satellite, or at least a rocket that would get you a satellite, and you put that satellite in a north-south orbit over North America, which would be the longest route over North America, and you explode a nuclear weapon 20 miles in the air, no one is hurt. Not one life is lost. No property is destroyed. But no computer in North America works.
Life is down.
Life is down. How do you survive? Are you capable of growing enough food to feed your family? Because there's no food that's going to be delivered. There isn't a computer that would work. This is an EMP. And they have EMP strategies. It's not as if I'm talking about something out of Buck Rogers. This is a reality. And so we are living in a very dangerous world where the Iranians, the Chinese, or a non-state actor could pretty much destroy us without harming one person. And if it were a non-state actor, how do you know he's responsible? How do you retaliate?
And how can we trust somebody that can blow his own body for an ideology? How can you trust him with the nuclear weapon? Like, pretty much you get a guy that was in prison for 50 years because he's a murderer, professional murderer, and you give him a rifle. And like, here.
Well, Michael, you raise a fascinating point, because in the Cold War, we had mutually assured destruction. We held the civilian population of the Russians hostage. They held the civilian population of the United States hostage. And that led to a simple idea of standoff. And it was MAD, mutually assured destruction. What does mutually assured destruction or deterrence mean at the moment when in fact you have people who are saying, we prefer death to life? What does it mean under those circumstances? If you have a theology that argues you're better off in paradise than you are here, you will live a better life, you can live a life with all of the virgins you want, you give up your life. Now, if you're shahadist and you're willing to die for Islam, then you're willing to use nuclear weapons.
You're willing to do anything. If you give away your own soul and your own body, I mean, what else you care about?
That is the problem with deterrence in the 21st century. That's where we stand. And so it's a very, very different set of conditions. Now, again, I don't know how you bring about stability under these circumstances. I really do not. But it really is, it's a very, very dangerous world. This is the most perilous moment in American history, in my judgment. It is certainly the most perilous moment in my lifetime.
I feel like we're like every other civilization we heard of in the history, that they reach to a certain extent and they start destroying their own selves. So, I mean...
Well, the historian Arnold Toynbee once made the point that civilizations die of suicide rather than murder. What he meant by that is that the internal factors in a society very often lead to decay and destruction. It's not merely the enemies from without. In this case, America, circa 2015, it is both the internal enemies, the madness that we have in this country, the peculiar activities that are occurring in American universities, where you see the attack on the First Amendment on free speech, and the activities outside, namely ISIS and terrorist groups that want to kill you.
The London Center for Policy Research, organization that I presently head, has done a lot of work in this area. And what we have found is that most Americans in the past think of bread and butter issues as their salary and increased wages and jobs. This is understandable. The character of a political campaign in the United States is changing today. I don't normally quote Trotsky, but Trotsky once said, "You may not want war, war wants you." The war is now here. It's in Chattanooga. It's in the streets of Paris. It's in the marathon at Boston. It is in Texas, Fort Hood, Texas. So that we now find ourselves at war. We may not want it. Most Americans obviously do not like the idea of engaging in another war. But the war is here and we have to defend ourselves. We need someone who can provide leadership. The person in the Republican Party who can provide that kind of leadership is going to be the next president of the United States.
So, I feel like we're giving up on, President Obama and the current administration of fixing this problem. So let's move on to the next election. Maybe there's hope in the next election. What's going on? I would like you to educate my viewer about the American election, the 2016, who's out there, and your insights about the whole process.
Well, the Democratic Party has 3 nominees at the moment, but only one is a serious candidate. Hillary Clinton will most likely get the nomination unless the FBI issues a separate report talking about the violation of top secret security matters that were within her control and revealed through her emails. That's a possibility. I wouldn't rule that out. If that happened,
I know that there was a hearing before the Congress, I believe.
Hearing before the Congress on Benghazi.
Yeah.
And the one thing that came out of the hearing, even though the New York Times said that it was the best day in her political life, I'm not sure it was such a good day.
I completely disagree.
Yeah, I mean, when she admitted that there was a lie, that she lied about what happened in Benghazi, she said to her daughter and to the Prime Minister of Egypt that this was an attack by Al-Qaeda. It was an organized attack. And she said that the day of the attack. And then she said to Ty Woods' father, this Ty Woods was a SEAL who was defending the embassy till the moment he lost his life so that some people could escape. And she said to him, "We will remember your son by jailing the fellow who made the trailer on the Prophet Muhammad because he was the one responsible for this spontaneous attack."
Wow.
Well, this is a lie.
This is all lies.
An absolute, I mean, you can't say it any other way. She said it was the fog of war. Well, it wasn't a fog of war because she made that statement to the Prime Minister of Egypt and to her daughter the night of the attack. So she knew exactly what was happening.
And why did she need to use a private server to communicate with other people in Americans in Libya and other parts of the world? There's something shady there, something not right.
And again, the trust factor will play a very significant role in this campaign. If you are on the Republican side, you simply make the point time and again, Hillary Clinton is untrustworthy.
So,
and so that will be the Republican campaign.
Well, you don't have to be Republican. You just need to have a brain to find out that you cannot trust this woman.
Well, not everyone sees it that way. Right?
Yeah, you cannot trust this woman.
I agree. On the Republican side, you have far too many candidates.
Yeah, and that's a problem.
And that is a problem. Fortunately, this time around, which is different from the last election, the Republicans have not been attacking one another very much. It does happen. and Trump is mainly responsible for it. Donald Trump, I do not regard as a serious candidate. He is bombastic, but he doesn't really understand policy. He is notoriously silent when there's a discussion about policy issues. He doesn't really have a policy. He came up with a tax plan. Some people like it, some people don't. But if you were to talk to him about foreign policy, he says things like, well, I'm strong, I'm tough, I can stand up to foreign leaders. That's not a policy. There are other candidates in this who I think could conceivably emerge as one of the serious nominees. Cruz, Rubio, Fiorina, I think are three of those people who have to be taken somewhat seriously and could emerge as front runners in this race when the winnowing process occurs. And it will occur with the Iowa primary and then New Hampshire. And those two primaries, after those two primaries, there will not be 15 candidates left in this race.
I remember in Egyptian elections where Morsi was part of the elections, he was the only candidate for the Muslim Brotherhood, and the other good group, they had like 11 or 12 people, and it was a problem because, you know, the votes were scattered all over those 12 people. Meanwhile, they solidified all the votes of the Muslim Brotherhood and the people that are sympathizing with the religious group to one candidate. So I'm afraid that the same thing happens here, where Hillary gets all the Democratic and the people that sympathize with her being a woman, and she, you know, she got in trouble for no reason, this, that. Meanwhile, the votes of the Republicans would be scattered over 3 or 4 or more people. It's a problem. I think it's time for a wake-up call for the Republicans to solidify and just gather together under one umbrella and say that we have at least, you know, a max of 1 or 2 or maximum 3 people to choose from. But 6 people, 10 people, 11 people, it's a joke.
Well, I happen to agree with that analysis. In the last election, when Romney was the candidate of the party, the Democratic campaign was actually set during the Republican primary season because Santorum and Newt Gingrich went after Romney. And by the time that campaign season was over, even though Romney got the nomination, he was perceived by Republicans, not merely Democrats, as a rich white guy who was out of touch. It was a distinctly unfair characterization, but it played well with the Democrats. So that was the campaign. He is not the kind of person that you would like as president. He's not a popular figure. He's not one of us. If you ask questions in the last campaign about who has the best foreign policy, the best economic policy, the best social policy, Romney won hands down. But if you asked who is the most likable, Obama was the most likable. And interestingly, when people go in and they pull that lever and they're about to vote, they don't necessarily vote on the basis of rational considerations.
Yeah.
It's his appearance, it's how cool
The way
he
he
is,
talks,
the way he
and-
talks. Is he one of us? Is he a likable guy? Is he a good guy?
Takes selfies, he goes,
Right.
you know.
I mean, if in fact you look at some of the characters who've been president of the United States, under no circumstances could they be president today. Woodrow Wilson was an unlikable character. Unlikable. He probably wasn't a good president either, but that's neither here nor there. He was elected. And if people really knew FDR, I'm not sure that the real FDR would have been so likable. And if you know the history of Bill Clinton, as we do now, there's a lot about his past and the bimbo activities that clearly would have made him an unacceptable candidate today. But things have changed. And now the likability factor is everything, and people vote out of emotion. There's been a dumbing down in America, and the dumbing down has its effect on the political process. And that is a great danger in my judgment.
Yeah.
If you ask people, I don't know if you've ever seen some of these late night talk shows where they stop young people on the street and they ask them obvious questions. What is the capital of the United States?
Yeah.
They don't know. Who is the vice president of the United States? They don't know.
I think Judge Jeanine Pirro did one of those interviews with the people, asking them who's the president, who is the capital of the U.S., and people were...
I'm amazed.
Who's running for presidency, and they
amazed.
don't even know. It's like, oh, Obama is like, oh.
Several years ago,
Obama's not running
it
for
was
presidency
a very illuminating moment for me. There was a poll that was taken, a survey rather, and they asked 24 questions that are basic questions about American life, and they asked these questions to people who graduated from college, recently graduated from college. And the questions were of a fairly, I think, sophomoric variety. Who was president during World War II? How do you find the area of a rectangle? Who was the author of the Republic? Who said of the people, by the people, for the people? By the way, the most common answer to that was Thomas Jefferson, not Abraham Lincoln. I mean,
Wow.
and there were 24 questions. So my mother was a high school dropout. I gave her the 24 questions. In 5 minutes, she answered them all correctly.
Wow.
Because any reasonable person would know the answer. Only 15% of college students and as
Answer the
graduates in the United States can answer all 24 questions accurately.
Crazy.
Now this to me suggests a great deal. It explains in large part why the Obamas get elected. Imagine if you run a campaign saying, hope and change. Hope for what? What kind of change? What are you talking about, hope and change? Well, project on it anything that you believe. That's what he said, in effect. Now that won the election. Now that is amazing to me. I mean, if he said, here are my policy positions, I'm going to lay them out for you. No. He ran a campaign that was entirely ambiguous. Didn't want people to know what the policies were, and still won the election.
Well, I don't
Twice.
know if there was a policy to start with.
No. But it is very interesting to me that this is what presidential politics have become.
Correct.
President Ford once made the comment, a government that is able to give you everything you want is capable of taking everything you have. It's important to understand we cannot let the government be in that position. We have to take back what is rightfully ours. The fruits of our labor belong to us. They do not belong to Washington bureaucrats. So I am proud to say I'm in America, but I want to remember what America was once like. You're going to help me do that because we are here to start the second American Revolution. Thank you.
I have a problem with having a third Bush running for presidency, even though I don't know the guy. He might be the sweetest heart ever. He might be a very nice guy, but just the fact his last name is Bush is a problem for me.
I think there are a lot of Republicans who feel the same way. We've had enough of the Bushes. And it's interesting, he is the one with the most money, the best organization, the people who I think knows something about foreign policy. But unfortunately, his fortunes have faded. And they faded largely because of the sentiment that you just expressed. People said enough
He should
of the
change.
Bushes.
If he changes his last name, I think he might have a chance of getting somewhere. But the fact he's a Bush, it's a problem. It's the same problem that we had in Egypt when Mubarak's son wanted to take over, and I'm like, it's happening here in the U.S. So what's going on?
Well, we don't need dynasties in America.
Right.
It's an argument for Hillary Clinton, too, by the way.
The same thing with the Clinton, I was about to say.
Yeah. And I think that, Bush handles it well because I've been to an event where someone said to him, do we need another Bush? And he said to this fellow who asked the question, let me ask you a question. Do you have a father who's still alive? He said, yes. He said, do you have any siblings? He said, as a matter of fact, I have 2 brothers. He said, well, I want to ask you a question. Does the family get together during the Christmas holiday? He said, yes. He says, well, when they get together, do they all agree? They agree on everything. He said, no. Brothers and fathers always fighting, and we disagree on lots of matters. He said, well, why do you think I'm different? So what he was saying is, yeah, I'm a Bush, but I'm not the same as my father and not the same as my brother.
I actually don't, my problem is not like he's the same like his father or his brother, but he's just a Bush.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
True.
This is the problem.
Well, I don't think
as
he's
I
going
said, he
anywhere.
might be the most efficient president ever. He might be the greatest president that we ever have, but I have a problem that he's a Bush, and I have a problem with Hillary beside everything else. I have a problem with her, but she's a Clinton.
No, look, Michael, I understand your point of view, and it's a point of view that's shared by many Republicans. Many feel very much the same way. And it's one of the reasons why Bush has not gained traction during this campaign season. Part of it is also the fact that the format is a format for entertainment. That is, it's a debate season. Can you, in 30 seconds, say something that would be impressive? Now, keep in mind, we've compressed the campaign to 30-second bites, sound bites. And you know something about TV.
Yeah.
How can you engage someone in a serious discussion in 30-second sound bites?
It's almost impossible.
I've had this dream. I'm the host of a TV program. It's late night TV. It's like Fallon or Jay Leno or one of these programs. And on the program I have Aristotle, and I have Karl Marx, and I have Immanuel Kant. I don't know, I picked 3 names out. Immanuel Kant, you wrote this big book, Critique of Pure Reason. It's a big fat book. I mean, it's hard for me to read all of this stuff. And even my assistants haven't been able to summarize it adequately. Now look, we've got 30 seconds before a commercial break. You want to tell us what's in this book? And by the way, you don't mind if I call you Manny. I'm not going to call you Emmanuel, right? So, Immanuel Kant, who is a brilliant thinker, is made into a fool. Or Karl Marx. Oh, you wrote this book about capitalism. You're a challenge of capitalism. But in the inside, you say, je ne suis pas Marxiste. What do you mean you're not a Marxist? You say your name is Karl Marx. What do you mean you're not a Marxist?
You got to do it within 30 seconds.
Well, look, I got a minute here. Give you a chance to explain that. Karl Marx is not a serious person. Yeah. So the difficulty that you have in this world is that it's all entertainment. And we amuse ourselves to death. We destroy ourselves because we cannot engage in a serious conversation. And if you even talk to kids today, they talk in 120 characters because that's all you can tweet with. You tweet with 120 characters. Well, what can you say in 120 characters? Think about that. And then what do they say? They're looking at this device all the time. They can't even look you in the eye.
Yeah.
And so conversation is very limited, which becomes a big problem.
People text within their own homes now. They, upstairs and downstairs, there's lunch.
Right, exactly. I have a secretary nearby. She communicates with me through a phone. She could walk 10 steps and be in my presence. But that's the way you communicate. It's a problem.
It is a problem.
It's a very big problem, and it's a big problem because the lack of communication also brings down the ability to engage in serious exchanges on the political front. How can you engage in a serious conversation? It's very hard.
I was worried when Hillary ran for presidency because she would be the only woman running for presidency and she might have taken advantage of that, but I was happy to know that Carly Fiorina was running for Republican to, for me as an American to oppose or to balance out the picture. Shouldn't we back up at least one male Republican and Carly Fiorina from the Republican Party to oppose what's happening on the Democratic?
Well, look, even though I'm not a sexist, I like to get the competent people there, and then the gender is not critical for me.
But they played the race card in Obama's time, and I know that they were going to play the race card, the gender card in the coming up.
Michael, you're absolutely right. There's absolutely no question, and that's one of the reasons why I'd like to see Carly on the Republican ticket, even if she's not the number one. Having her on the ticket, and she's chomping at the bit to engage Hillary in debate. I mean, she would love it. And she would tear Hillary apart, I believe. So I think she becomes a real asset for the Republican Party. Will they recognize that? Will she do well in the primaries? It's hard to say at this point. Her star appears to be fading in the polls. But again, I don't know how accurate these polls are. We saw what happened in the Kentucky gubernatorial race, where this guy comes from nowhere, no pollster, so that he has a chance, and he wins the election.
Yeah.
So, and you look at Cameron, and he won the prime minister position in England when every single poll said it was not possible.
He's doing great now in the polls, and we don't know what's going to happen.
He has a following. Trump has a following. Will it continue? I'm very doubtful, because as I said, the following tends to be based on anger. Anger is not sustainable. Trump has to say something that's substantive. He has not done so yet. So, I mean, he becomes an extension of a reality show. The campaign is like a reality show. Say things that will get attention. Well, foolish and silly they may be is unimportant.
Like I hate all the Mexicans.
Right,
how can you hate all the Mexicans? How can you think all the Mexicans are criminals? How can a person running a country that Spanish is a second language
and then he wants to build a wall, but he wants the Mexicans to
pay for it? I'm like, please.
So the prime minister of Mexico is going to hand them a check. I mean,
and these people they come here.
Foolish.
It is.
It's just foolish, and then. You have illegal immigrants in the United States, and no question that they have violated the sovereignty of this country. But you're going to go into their homes, if they've lived here for years, pull them out of their homes and send them back to Mexico or where they came from?
There are ways to try to rehabilitate them, get them into the society.
Well, I've written about it, and I think there are things that you can do. First thing that you can do is if you really want them to put them on a pathway to some kind of citizenship. Let's not call it amnesty, but some kind of citizenship, recognizing the fact that they have to pay for this. You would take those who pay taxes, who've lived here for 3 years and have not committed felony offenses. Do you know how many immigrants fall into that category? Illegal immigrants.
I don't know the exact
3
number,
million
but I
of the
think-
11 million.
Wow.
So we're not talking about that big a problem.
Wow.
So it's not 11 million, it's 3 million.
3 million.
So let's talk about dealing with the 3 million. They join the military service, they pay their taxes, they live law-abiding lives, they have not committed felonies. Fine, I'd give those people a shot.
Or you can give him a permanent residency with kind of a contingency upon 10 years. If you have a legal residency for 10 years with no problems, we'll give you the citizenship.
Right.
You know,
I mean, but the way in which this is all conceived, it's 11 million, we're going to throw them out of the country. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And so Trump likes to say these things because they generate attention. But they're not serious policy matters. There's no one in the policy front that I'm aware of that takes Trump seriously. And he doesn't prepare. He's not prepared.
if you have no choice but to choose from Trump and Hillary Clinton,
I would choose Trump. I would hold my nose. I would do whatever I could to support him. But I can't say that I would do it with any enthusiasm.
yeah, and London Center for Policy Research. I want to educate my viewers about it and also recognize the great effort that you have been putting to make this successful and to try to bring America back to the Americans and trying to mediate a good platform between the Americans and other parts of the region in the Middle East to reunite the efforts against terrorism. So talk
Well,
to me
Michael,
about it.
thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the comment. The London Center was really organized around the principle that what we want to do is in the best interest of this country. We feel that the foreign policy issues to some degree have languished, and that what we want to do is establish an appropriate foreign policy position for the United States. We're not a partisan organization. Our policies could be embraced by Democrats or Republicans. What we are interested in is the policies that would make sense for this country. We spend a lot of time not only in the Middle East but in the Far East as well, where a lot of thought has gone into what has happened with the Chinese air perimeter in the South China Sea. So we're very much interested in what happens in that region as well. But there is a focus that we've had in the Middle East. And as I indicated before in passing, I think what we would like to see is the emergence of a NATO that would be led by Egypt and would play a significant role in serving as a counteraction to what the Iranians are doing and what ISIS is also engaged in. And I think that that kind of army and military preparation, what I call a defense condominium, is a very important development. And we at the London Center have been working hard to make sure that that happens. That has been one of the features of the London Center over the last couple of years.
Believe it or not, I would agree with you. It is a failed policy. And as you know, I'm somebody who tends to stand up for President Obama when I can and when I think it's appropriate. This strategy obviously has not worked. There's no value in suggesting otherwise. The question that we face now is, what do we do about it? Do we begin by increasing the sorties? Because you're right, it's only 7 or so a day, obviously not having the impact we would like. Do we begin by increasing what we're doing in the air? Do we attempt to push our allies in the region, the Saudis, the Jordanians, to put their troops into the field of play, or do we just go for it and send over American troops?
Well, first of all, sending over American troops, I think, would be very difficult. Politically, that would be very difficult indeed. However, increasing the number of special forces...
not
Right. Well, I'm talking about politically.
Right.
Increasing the number of special forces from 3,047, what we have at the moment, to something on the order of 10,000 would make a difference. That's not a dramatic increase when you think about it, but it would help. Second thing that I would do is I would be on the phone with President Sisi of Egypt and say, look, why not pool the resources of the Sunni nations, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, perhaps Jordan and Kuwait, and simply say, look, let's put together a force of some kind that would serve as a counterweight to whatever ambitions the ISIL people have.
How long would that take, pragmatically speaking, to really have an impact with that?
One day. I mean,
Really?
yeah, they're prepared to engage in it. Look, they have that.
Do they have good enough forces to do
They
this?
have F-16s. The Egyptian army is fighting a war in the Sinai.
Right.
They're battle-hardened. They've got a tough army. They are prepared to engage in this kind of struggle. They realize that you need, one, a counterweight to Iran, and two, a counterweight to ISIL. I think those nations are prepared to do something, but they're not going to do it unless there's American leadership. They want to know the Americans stand behind them.
Any plans, like short-term goals, long-term goals beside...
Well, the short-term goal that we have is there's legislation that we have helped to promote on creating the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. I think it has to be identified as a terrorist organization in the United States. As you know, the Muslim Brotherhood is banned in Egypt, is now banned in Saudi Arabia. It is banned throughout...
But yet they're on TV 2 days ago, in national American TV, saying that those terrorist attacks in Paris has nothing to do with religion.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who you've met and is a friend of mine, has made the point, not every Muslim is a terrorist, of course.
Of course, not every.
And it's absurd to even make that suggestion. But there is the invocation of Islamic ideas within the terrorist front, and that cannot be denied.
They translate it their way.
That's right. When President Sisi had the courage, and we've chatted about this before, when he had the courage to go to Al-Azhar, the center of Islamic theological thought, and he said that there is a violent element within our religion, and that we need, quote him, a revolution from within to deal with it. It was a very thoughtful and important speech, very important. In my judgment, among the most important speeches given in the last half century. The problem is it has not gotten the kind of attention it deserves.
You mentioned once that it was like Martin Luther King's...
Well, like Martin Luther and 95 Theses, yes. But yesterday the president was on TV and he made the point, what we are seeing in Paris has nothing to do with Islam. But it does, it's not a question of Islam. There's the use of Islam as an invocation for the kind of terrorist activities that ISIS has engaged in. And that's a little more subtle point, but it's a point that I think has to be made. And the president doesn't get it. Ayaan Hirsi Ali does. And if we realize that we've got to deal with the moderates within this religion who will help to create an environment that is very different from the one that now prevails. It's only 10%, I'm using a number that's coming out of the air, 5% of the Islamic population that shares this radical sensibility. It's still a very large army with 1.3 billion
people.
It's a large army. And we have to make sure that the moderate position becomes the prevailing position. Yesterday I had lunch with a friend of mine who's a Sufi. And he said to me, I read the Mecca portion of the Quran. I said, why only the Mecca portion? Because he said the Medina portion deals with violence. I'm not a violent man, I'm a pacifist. Well, okay, there's an answer. Use a portion of the Quran that deals with the Mecca period, when the Prophet Muhammad was not a major force, was not engaged in violent activity, and the sentiments are very much sentiments like those you would hear in the West. It's based on peace and understanding. There are answers, and that's the sort of thing that we have to encourage. Now, this man, I would trust with my life. He would not harm me or harm anyone else. He recognizes the virtue of life. But it's the extremists that talk about death being better than life. And that's the sort of thing that we have to argue against.
And I think, part of solving the problem is to start with realizing that there isn't a problem, right?
Well, you have to define it. You have to realize it. Exactly.
Yeah, we can't just keep coming on TV and commenting after every single attack, say that has nothing to do with religion. It's absurd.
It is ridiculous. It is ridiculous. And, fortunately, there are people like you who understand. And fortunately, there are some in our country who understand. But I'm sad to say there are too many people across the globe who do not get it.
Yeah.
And the President of the United States, in some ways, I think, has been exceedingly naive. If not naive, then he is obviously myopic. He has just been blind to what is going on around him.
What's your expectations for Egypt in the next 2 years and in the next 10 years?
Number one, the major issue that Mr. Sisi has to face is, of course, the terror within his own society, and deal with the Muslim Brotherhood, deal with the ISIS problem in the Sinai. That's number one. But number two, the bigger problem is the problem of unemployment for young people in Egypt. You have 91 million people in the country. At one point, 22 million people in Egypt worked in tourist business. There's no tourist industry today because we have State Department advisories. And after the Russian plane went down in the Sinai, what tourist is going to go to Egypt? I think I told you that the last time I was there, I went to the pyramids. There were two gentlemen standing in front of me. They were engaged in conversation. I thought they were on the queue. I'm standing behind them for about 15 minutes until I finally realized there is no queue.
There's no queue.
You could walk right in. And when I got there and then went to get a camel, to ride my camel like Lawrence of Arabia to the pyramids, this camel driver says to me, "How many camels would you like?" How many camels? I can only ride one.
Yes.
He had no business. There was no business.
Yeah.
So
It's very sad.
It is very sad
especially
because-
with a place that has 2/3 of the world, pharaoh and civilization and
I mean, you
ancient.
think of the magnificent culture and civilization
Unbelievable.
created in Egypt. Of course, people from around the globe would like to see this, but now, recognizing the danger, the tourist business has dried up. So one, this president has an obligation to do something on the economic front. He's got to find jobs for young people. There must be economic development in Egypt. He needs big, massive infrastructure projects. The railroad line that's going along the coast, the spine of Africa, into the Suez, be helpful. The new cyber arrangement that the Chinese are working on in Egypt is important. They'll create an infrastructure. These are massive programs that are exceedingly important in creating jobs. I've been to the university in Cairo. Kids were great. I love the students who were there. The problem is every single one of the students that I met said, well, I think I'm going to London looking for a job. I think I'm going to, maybe I'll go to Madrid and try to find a job. I didn't hear anyone say, I want to stay in Cairo. Now, these were terrific young people, probably better educated than American students. They represent the future of Egypt, but it's not a future if people are all leaving. And the best of the graduates in the university had said there aren't any opportunities for us.
A country with no youth, a country with no future, right?
That has to change. I think Sisi, by the way, gets it. I think he understands that.
But he has so much to.
But as I say, he's got a plate that's full. He's got
Yeah.
enemies from within. He's got ISIS to deal with. I mean, look,
There are other countries that are trying to pressure him.
I don't envy this man. I happen to think that he is the best that Egypt can produce at this time. I happen to think that Egypt is fortunate to have him as a leader. But he is a leader that is confronting extraordinary issues. This is a country that cannot feed its own population. The Nile is not fertile enough to feed 91 million people. And you're increasing at the rate of 1 million a month. The population growth is explosive. They've controlled the price of bread, so you can get bread at a reasonable price. But even if you look at fava beans, which is one of the staples in the Egyptian diet, become very expensive.
Yep.
So, I mean, there's no question that these economic problems loom very large, very large. So when you give me the long-term future, I would say if you can tell me what the unemployment rate looks like, and you can tell me what kind of economic growth is occurring in Egypt, I will tell you what kind of long-term future they have. If you want to deal with the short-term, you got to deal with the enemy. You've got to crush the Brotherhood. You've got to do everything that you can to deal with the ISIS problem in the Sinai.
So to set his priorities straight is to take care of the country from the security point of view first.
Right. And he's got to deal with
But
his own...
meanwhile, he's going to be losing his youth going out to...
He's got to deal with the human rights problem too. I mean, it's not helpful when the United States and others look at the human rights violations. He's got to be a lot more careful and thoughtful about how these matters are handled. But all things considered, this is an enormous agenda. Enormous agenda. And it's a poor country. I mean, Egypt could be a rich country. I mean, if you go back to the years when tourism was at its height, Egypt was doing fairly well.
See, regarding, I'm sorry to cut you off, but regarding the human rights issue, I mean, there's a lot of human rights violation every day in Turkey, and nobody talks about it.
Right, that's true.
But Egypt is under the microscope.
That's true.
Small thing happens, everybody talks about it.
Very
There's a
good.
lot of, you know what I mean?
It's a very good point. And it's absolutely true. There's hypocrisy. There's a double standard that exists. Erdogan gets away with the abuse of his own population.
Yeah.
And there's very little
Just
to say.
decides one day and wakes up in the morning, I don't want Twitter in my country. Ban Twitter.
But keep in mind, we have an American air base there, so we avert our gaze. We want that air base, which is needed in order to send whatever few
Well,
planes
the same
we
thing you
into
do
Syria.
with Qatar is the
Same thing.
same exact
Same
thing.
thing.
There's a lot of violations there, and nobody talks about.
Exactly, exactly. And again, part of the difficulty in the world today is that members of the press are in fact engaged in a double standard. There is tremendous hypocrisy.
Yeah, New
Things-
York Times, for God's sake, New York Times is supposed to be the most reputable newspaper in the world, and
They become an extension of the Democratic Party. So they'll excuse some nations and excuse some activities and not excuse others. And we have seen this across the globe. Look, there are these terrible incidents that are occurring in Israel at the moment, a kind of Intifada 3, where people are using knives and simply killing people randomly. Old women, children, have a knife put in their back. You would think, these are unprovoked attacks. How can you countenance something like that? No one writes about it. Very little coverage is given to this. And then if Israel does retaliate, and retaliate in a big way, by bombing some of the centers for terrorist activity in that part of the world.
let's see a reaction.
The reaction, the world reaction. There'll be photographs and there'll be children killed. And
It's how can we make peace, Dr. London? We want peace.
I always say, I want peace, but peace is an angelic goal. Peace exists in the mind of my God. But the world exists not with peace, but with stability. If we create stability, it's not a perfect world.
So it's good enough to have stability, but
I would say work to stability. If you can go beyond stability, fine. The notion of peace is one of these dreams. It has never been peace. There have always been hostility. And if you think about getting together with a group of 5 people, any 5 people, even those you call your friends, at some point there's going to be a dispute.
yep.
I guarantee it. And disputes are natural. It's part of human nature. It's in the passions of being a person. And so there is always going to be disputes. Now the
There's
question,
always disputes between a man and his wife.
How can it- but-
Men with his children.
but how do you create a civil environment in which these disputes can take place?
Yes.
How do you allow for differences of opinion to arise, but people don't go to war with one another? How do you create an environment where people say, okay, you believe in X, I believe in Y, but you know something, we can live with one another. That's what I call stability. And that framework for stability is what I think we should aim for.
Thank you very much, Dr. London, for your insights and valuable information and everything you've chat with us about. And we hope to see you again on the show.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Michael.
Thank you very much.
جوا منك حلم ممكن يبقى مش باين قوي وانت تايه بين حاجات وعايشها بدماغ فهلاوي عايش بتلعن في الظروف مع ناس هدفها تكون كده ناس قصدها تبقى موقفاك مش عايزة تبقى فيهم قوي شوف واقرا في كتاب التاريخ عمرك ما كنت في يوم غبي ده انت اللي علمت البشر شوف عاش في أرض